something we can do. Yes, there's something you can do. Yes, we can change the world. Yes, yes, change the world for good. Acts of random kindness, be a lifeline in the storm. Oh yes, we can change the world. Yes, yes, change the world for good. Acts of random kindness, be a lifeline in the storm. A lifeline in the storm.
Good evening. How is everybody doing? It's a Sunday night, the second day of our week. We're going to be doing a beautiful and efficient learning tonight. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we get together to do some beautiful learning on a Sunday night? Pauline in Arkansas, Yehuda in Florence, South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Renee in Indiana, Melissa in Great Neck, James in Indianapolis, John in Sedona, David in Indiana, Christo in Lubbock, Paul in the Great Northwest, Paula in Chicago, Patrice says Shalom, Gwen in Michigan, Zach Plotzker, always great to see you, tuning in, I believe, from Nevada. And Bill in the stormy Midwest. I believe we're going to be the stormy Southern California tomorrow. Big rain in the forecast. Welcome Gigi on the YouTube side from British Columbia. A quick teaching from Rav Twersky from his book Living Each Day. Two teachings actually for every day of the year. And here's one for today, the 18th of Cheshvan. On the very famous verse in the Torah, love your fellow as yourself. Rav Twersky brings down Rabbi Yaakov Yitzhak of Pesicha, who said that just as with your own person, you may value one part of your body more than another. You might be more fond of your eyes, than of your pinky nail. Could be. Not everybody. Can't make assumptions, but probably you value your eyes more than your pinky nail. Does that mean you'd be willing to give up your pinky nail? Certainly not. Every part of yourself is very dear to you. Now that we're being told to love your fellow man as yourself, well, just as you might like some parts of yourself more than other parts, but you still find every part of yourself dear to you, likewise, right, all our neighbors should be dear to us, even though some people are going to be much more dear to us than others. Right, so says Rabbi Yaakov Yitzhak of Pesicha, though you may value one part more than another, nevertheless, you take great caution not to allow any part of yourself to be injured. And so it should be with your fellow man. Even the person who you esteem the least, warrants great respect. Says Rav Twersky, some people espouse an unrealistic concept of equality. The simple fact is, that people are not all equally endowed. They possess different attributes, different characteristics, and hence there are people whom we personally will value above others for a variety of reasons. Simplest case, I'm going to value members of my family more than I value members of not my family. I'm going to value my friends more than I'm going to value strangers. That's natural, and we shouldn't expect people to think that all people are equally dear to me. Some people we downright dislike. Yes, we do. That's reality. It's human to feel that way. Nevertheless, even the people that we like the least are worthy of our respect and human treatment. Yet, says the Rabbi of Pesicha, such distinctions do not permit us to slight someone whom we consider to be of lesser stature. Although our hearts and eyes have far greater value to us than our toes or finger, nevertheless, we are very protective of every single part of ourselves. And to love your neighbor as yourself, right? It's not like a general idea, love my neighbor as myself. It's love my neighbor as I love the parts of myself. That's what we're learning here. To love your neighbor as yourself means to accord the least of people the same respect that you do to the least of yourself. A teaching well worth remembering the next time we're in the presence of somebody who really annoys us. Okay. Where are we holding? Today is our last day discussing Mishna number 1 of chapter 1 here in Tractate Rosh Hashana, the 9th volume of the Talmud. We are on page 15. Tomorrow, with God's help, we'll be starting Mishnah number 2 in chapter 1. Tonight's class will be an efficient class. Nina and I got last-minute tickets to go see a rock concert. Sometimes you feel old, sometimes you feel young. When you're going to a rock concert, you feel young. So, as soon as this class ends, we are on our way and we don't want to be late. So we're going to keep it moving. I will still take questions, but it works out very well because the page is not very long. And we're not covering the whole page anyway because there's a lot of, sort of technically redundant material. We start at the bottom of the B side of page 14. Rabba bar Rav Huna said, now that Rabban Gamliel has said that the tithe year of an esrog, a citron, follows the time of the picking of its fruit like a vegetable, its new year for tithing is Tishrei, like other vegetables, right? So the esrog, one of the 4 species that we wave on Sukkot, is set apart from other fruits, at least according to some opinions, in that it's considered like a vegetable, and we're going to tithe it in the year of its picking, as opposed to the year of its formation, like other fruits. That's what we learned yesterday, right? But the Gemara raises an objection from a Baraisa. In the Baraisa, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, if one picked the fruit of an esrog tree on the eve of the 15th of Shvat, right? So remember that the 15th of Shvat is the new year for trees, right? So that if you pick a fruit before the 15th of Shvat, it belongs to the previous year. After the 15th of the month of Shvat, which is approximately February, more or less, it's of the new year, and it gets tithed with the new year. Vegetables, right, which have shorter growing cycles, their new year is the 1st of Tishrei, the fall month of Tishrei. The 1st of Tishrei is actually the holiday of Rosh Hashana. So if we're going to say that the esrog is likened to a vegetable in that it's going to be tithed at the time of its picking rather than at the time of its formation, okay, so that would imply that the new year for the esrog is the 1st of Tishrei. But in this Baraisa, they're going to focus on the 15th of Shvat, which according to Beis Hillel and the law that we follow, is the new year for trees, which would seem that the esrog therefore is likened to other fruit of other trees. So in the Baraisa, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, if one picked the fruit of an esrog tree on the eve of Tu B'Shvat, on the eve of the 15th of Shvat, meaning on the 14th of Shvat, before the sun had set, and then he picked more fruit after sunset, which means it has become the 15th of Shvat, one may not set aside teruma, that's a tithe for, a tithe that's set apart for the Kohanim, for the priests, and other tithes from one for the other. Right? If you pick fruit from the same tree before the new year arrived and then some more fruit after the new year arrived, you're not going to be able to tithe from one pile for the other pile. These piles have to be kept separate because one pile was picked in the outgoing year and the other pile was picked in the incoming year, and they need to be tithed separately. You can't set aside fruit from one pile to fulfill the tithing requirements of the other pile because they were picked in different years. According to this Baraisa, that division line is the 15th of Shvat, which is like the fruit, like other trees and the other fruit-bearing trees. And this is why it contradicts the idea that the esrog is going to be treated like vegetables whose new year is the 1st of Tishrei. So if he did this, and then the Baraisa continues, as one from the other, as one may not set aside teruma and tithes from the new crop for the old, or from the old crop for the new. If he did this when it was the 3rd year of the sabbatical year cycle going into the 4th year, right? In the third year, the tithes are poor, the second tithe is a poor man's tithe. In the fourth year, the second tithe is for yourself to make the pilgrimage festival to Jerusalem. So if he did this when it was the third year of the sabbatical year, going into the fourth year, the law is as follows. From what he picked in the third year, what he picked on the 14th of Shvat, right, in the late afternoon, from what he picked in the fourth year, from what he picked in the third year, he must set aside first tithe and poor man's tithe. That's what we do in the third year. And from what he picked in the fourth year, he must set aside first tithe and second tithe, meaning the second tithe that you spend when you make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And the Gemara clarifies this ruling. Whom did you hear that said the tithe year of an esrog follows the time of the picking of its fruit? It was Rabban Gamliel. And yet this Baraisa is teaching that the new year for tithing an esrog is the 15th of Shvat, against the opinion of Rabba bar Rav Hana, who says that according to Rabban Gamliel, it is the first of Tishrei. Our Baraisa implies that the new year for the esrog is the 15th of Shvat, just like other fruit trees, but it seems like we just heard that Rabban Gamliel said that the first of, right? Let me double check that. That according to Rabban Gamliel, the new year for an esrog is the first of Tishrei, like vegetables. Now the Gemara that's what we just said. So rather, the Gemara will now say, wait a minute, we must have got our citations wrong somewhere. So the Gemara says, rather, if this was said, it was said as follows. Rabba bar Rav Huna said, even though Rabban Gamliel said that the tithe year of an esrog follows the time of the picking of its fruit, like a vegetable, nevertheless, its new year is in Shvat, like a tree. And the Gemara asks, what is different there in the Baraisa with regard to one who picked vegetables on the eve of Rosh Hashana, such that it teaches the case that when it was the second year of a sabbatical year going into the third year, and what is different here in the Baraisa dealing with one who was picking the fruit of an esrog tree on the eve of the 15th of Shvat, such that it teaches the case when it was the third year going into the fourth year. Right, so in one Mishnah, they were talking about what happens when you pick this fruit right near the division line, but it's distinguishing between the second year and the third year. And the Baraisa makes a distinction when you're harvesting this fruit right near the division line, but in the third year versus the fourth year. Why weren't both of them worded second year to third year? Or why weren't both of them worded third year to fourth year? Why was one with respect to second and third year and the other with respect to third and fourth year? And the main difference, remember, second year is like fourth year. First tithe, the teruma goes to the priest, first tithe goes to the Levite, and the second tithe is for you to go up to Jerusalem. Third year is unlike the second and fourth year, in that's where you set the second tithe is not the second tithe, rather it is the poor man's tithe. So really the difference is whether the kind of more standard is the outgoing year or the incoming year. Okay, and the Gemara answers, it teaches us a matter in passing. It was worded this way in the Mishna, second versus third year, and in our Baraisa, third year versus fourth year. And it is teaching us that it is damaging for an esrog when the tree is handled. And since everyone handles it in the sabbatical year, as all the orchards are declared ownerless, and everyone is permitted to enter and pick produce, the tree does not bear fruit that is fit for eating for another 3 years. Right, the sabbatical year is the 7th year of this cycle. When do we start talking about the 7th year? The question was asked, why is it worded, the division between second and third year or the division between third and fourth year? Now we're getting a point about the 7th year. But, right, when the Shemitah laws are really in effect, meaning the temple is standing in the Holy Land and the farmers have great confidence that they don't need to plant in the 7th year because God is going to provide a superabundance in the 6th year. And therefore, in the 7th year, the trees will continue to bear fruit, but the farmer, the orchard owner, cannot harvest that fruit the way that he normally would, harvest it, sell it, etc. In fact, those orchards are treated as if they are ownerless, and anybody can enter the orchard and pick fruit just to eat for themselves. When they're doing that, it's damaging to the orchard, and the orchard responds, according to this teaching, that it doesn't bear fruit properly until the second year or even the third year after that sabbatical year. We skip down. We're going to go to the B side of page 15, but first I'm going to just read where the law came out about an esrog from the 6th year that was picked in the 7th year, the sabbatical year. A 6th year esrog that was picked in the sabbatical year. Now, right, so this is showing that the opinion that we follow is not the one that the esrog belongs to the year in which it was picked, but rather it belongs to the year in which it was formed. So a 6th year esrog is one which was formed in the 6th year, but it was only picked during the sabbatical year. The huge difference with respect to what we're talking about now is that in the 6th year, the farmer harvests his fruit and he must tithe his fruit. In the 7th year, there's no tithing because it's as if the trees are ownerless and anyone can come along and take for their needs, but not their commercial needs, just for what they're going to eat. So a 6th year esrog that was picked in the sabbatical year is treated as 6th year produce with regard to tithes. And as a stringency, it is treated as produce of the sabbatical year as well, since it was picked in the sabbatical year. So this is one of those cases where we're going to take the stringent view of two conflicting opinions just to be on the safe side. Yesterday we discussed that what you would not do is say, I follow Beis Shammai, which in general is more stringent than Beis Hillel, but in cases where the Beis Shammai opinion is more lenient than the Beis Hillel opinion, there I'm going to follow the stringencies of Beis Hillel, so I'm always following the most stringent opinion because I'm such a pious person. About one who acts that way, the Gemara said that person is a fool, because you should follow one consistent set of laws. Either you follow Beis Shammai or you follow Beis Hillel. It is permitted to follow Beis Shammai, at least in ancient times. Now, generally, you follow Beis Hillel. The law was established according to Beis Hillel, and therefore you get both the leniencies and the stringencies of Beis Hillel. You don't pick and choose your leniencies, which would make you wicked, nor do you pick and choose your stringencies, which would make you overly stringent and therefore foolish. However, in this situation, we do adopt the stringencies of the two sides, meaning that we're going to tithe the esrog because it formed in the 6th year, but with respect to the laws that appertain to fruit picked during the sabbatical year, we're going to adopt some stringencies there. And the Rambam rules in accordance with two contradictory opinions, following the opinion of an unattributed Mishna, following the opinion of an unattributed Mishna. The Rambam interpreted each source in the most narrow way, ruling in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish with regard to tithes, and in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis of Usha with regard to the sabbatical year. Although many disagree with the Rambam, the common practice follows his rulings. Right, and in terms of, this is not really our subject yet, but in terms of what can you do with fruit that's picked during the sabbatical year, right? Like, for one thing, you can't sell it, right? You can only pick according to your needs. There's all kinds of rules, things you cannot do during the sabbatical year. And as a matter of fact, I think at a certain point, you can't harvest it at all. But that's something else. We're not going to get into that right now. But we see the stringencies of 6th year for tithing and of the 7th year with respect to other matters. Now we're at the top of the B side of 15. It was stated, and I'm almost done, so if you got questions or comments, get them in. It was stated that the Amoraim, the sages of the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael, discussed this issue. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish both say an esrog from the 6th year of the sabbatical cycle that entered into and was picked in the sabbatical year, this is the law that we just read, is always and for all purposes considered as 6th year produce. When Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, a 6th-year esrog that entered into and was picked in the sabbatical year, the 7th year, although at the beginning of the sabbatical year, it was only the size of an olive bulk, and during the sabbatical year, it grew to the size of a loaf of bread, it is considered 6th-year produce that is subject to tithing, and if one eats it without tithing, he is liable for eating untithed produce. That's because even though only a little bit, it only reached a little bit of its size, right? An olive versus a loaf of bread. Nevertheless, it's considered to have formed during the 6th year and therefore subject to tithing, even though you only picked it off the tree during the sabbatical year when it was as fat as a loaf of bread. The sages taught in a Baraisa, a tree whose fruits were formed before the 15th of Shvat is tithed in accordance with the previous year. And if the fruits were formed after the 15th of Shvat, it is tithed in accordance with the coming year. Not picking, but formation. Rabbi Nehemiah said, in what case is this statement said? It is said with regard to a tree that produces 2 broods. 2 crops in a single year. And the Gemara immediately interrupts with a question about the wording of this Baraisa. Does it enter your mind to say 2 broods? Broods? Animals produce broods. Trees do not produce broods. Rather, say like 2 broods. In other words, 2 seasons worth of crops. Some fruit trees bear fruit at one time of the year. Other fruit trees bear fruit all during the year. That's why Torah is often likened to a fig tree, because a fig tree at any time of the year has some fruit that's ripe and ready to go, and other fruit that is just forming, and it's got fruit at all different stages of formation, ripening, just tiny little buds all the way to fully ripe fruit. But, like apples, I think only are harvested one time a year. Most fruit trees only once a year. But if it has 2 or more crops, then it's a different category. The Baraisa continues, but in the case of trees that produce only 1 brood of fruit, for example, palm trees and olive trees and carob trees, which yield fruit only once a year, although their fruit took form before the 15th of Shvat, they are tithed in accordance with the coming year, since they follow the time of their fruit's picking. According to Rabbi Nehemiah, most fruit will be tithed according to the time that the fruit is picked, since only a minority of fruit trees produce 2 crops a year. Rabbi Yochanan said, the people were accustomed to act with regard to carobs in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nehemiah that their tithe year follows the time of the fruit's picking. And finally, I'll just share the law. This is where we'll end and go to questions. The people were accustomed to act with regard to carobs. On this line, what is the law? According to the Rambam, only inferior varieties of carobs are tithed in accordance with the time of their picking, even if they were formed prior to the 15th of Shvat. And the Ravad holds that carobs are in principle no different from other fruit. According to the Ravad, the tithing of all fruit, besides olives and grapes, is by rabbinic law. According to the Ravad, the tithing of all fruits, other than olives and grapes, is by rabbinic law. We tithe them, but it's by rabbinic law. So in cases of doubt, we're going to be lenient. With respect to olives and grapes, which are 2 of the 7 species which characterize the rich fertility of Israel, those are tithed according to Torah law. And so if somebody eats untithed grapes or untithed olives, now that avera, that transgression, is at a much higher level because you're transgressing a Torah law, not a rabbinic ordinance. You have to follow the law either way, but in cases of doubt with respect to a Torah law, we'll be stringent. In cases of doubt with respect to a rabbinic ordinance, we'll be lenient. For this reason, even though it is incorrect, one does not protest against a custom to tithe according to the time of picking carobs or any other fruit. In the absence of such a custom, one should tithe all fruit according to the time of the formation of the fruit. So in certain areas, people had the custom to do carobs differently than in other areas. Since that tithing is by rabbinic ordinance, the sages could be more lenient and allow that local custom to continue. If there was a local custom that violated Torah law, they would not allow that. They would have to be stringent. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me check if there's any comments or questions. Julie Christensen, which laws do you follow? Well, I don't know that there's anyone who in modern times says, I hold by Beis Shammai. Right? I think that there were people in ancient times who would hold by Beis Shammai, and they were permitted to do so. The Gemara has told us it is permitted to hold by Beis Shammai. But now that the law 2,000 years ago was generally established according to Beis Hillel, except with certain defined exceptions, the way that Jewish law has come to be codified and that we follow, I think is pretty much always according to Beis Hillel. There's not somebody who's going to say, no, I do according to Beis Shammai, and therefore I follow Beis Shammai in all things. My impression is that you're not going to hear anyone say that today. It's like it was permitted back then when it was much more of recent vintage to be a follower of Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel, but I don't think anyone is following Beis Shammai now. That's my impression. I could be wrong, but that's my impression. Sharon, I am really unclear why an esrog would be considered like a vegetable. So we saw that yesterday, that an esrog is like a fruit tree in every other way, except that it's like a vegetable in terms of that we will give it a new year according to its picking rather than according to its formation. But as we've seen, not everybody holds by that. So that's just according to one opinion. Why would the esrog be set apart from other fruit? I have to guess that it's because it's mentioned specifically in the Torah because it's part of the four species, and so it's going to get a special treatment for that reason. It's not one of the 7 species that characterize the fecundity of the land of Israel, but it is a fruit that has a specific mitzvah attached to it. And therefore, that might be the reason that it was set apart. Stephen, so can you pick the fruit in year 1 after the sabbatical year since it would be considered grown in the sabbatical year? That's the question, right? Very good. It was formed during the sabbatical year. I think you can pick it for sure later. The question is, do you have to tithe it? Because you would think that, well, if we're following this idea that 6th year esrog that you then picked during you took off the tree during the sabbatical year, you still have to tithe it. Okay, well, what about an esrog that formed during the sabbatical year and now you pick it during the 1st year? Does that mean that you don't have to tithe it? Did we get an answer? Do we get an answer to that question? It's such a good question. I'm not seeing that. I'm not sure. It's a good question. It's a good question. Okay, and one last question off the topic, but something we discussed the other day. Yosef is reminding us that the other day we mentioned that the sages disagree. There were 2 sages who disagree. When is Mashiach going to come? Basically, at Passover or at Rosh Hashana? And did we resolve that dispute? Seems to me that we're certainly not sure when Mashiach is going to come. But it is part of our Passover Seder to pour a cup for Elijah, who is going to come and announce the coming of Mashiach. And we even opened the door for Elijah. So it seems like by our practices that it must be that we're giving preference to the opinion that Mashiach will come at Passover, since we don't have any practice that's like that with respect to Rosh Hashana. My impression. That's what I've got for us this evening. My holy sisters and brothers, God willing, we'll be together again tomorrow night at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, to cover page 16 here in Tractate Rosh Hashana. And finally, moving on to a new Mishnah, and it's a good Mishnah that opens at 4 times of the year, the world is judged. So to find out when we are judged, tune in tomorrow night. All the best.